Hello. So welcome to Change Agents, the Impact of Social Justice Docs. Thrilled to have here with me, beginning on my right, Talia Tibbin. She and Joshua Bennett are directors and producers of the film Sky and Ground. They are Jonathan Daniel Award winners, so you will see that film this evening, and I'll be talking with them at greater length tonight. And then to their right, I guess, Joey Carey, who is producer of The Organizer. The film is directed by Nick Taylor, but Joey is here with us today. And then representing on the New Hampshire front, we have Carlina Lyons. She is the writer, and Michael Venn, director of The Heroin Effect. So they all have more detailed bios in the program, but we'd love to get to the conversation, so we're going to move on from right there. So just I wanted to begin. Obviously, doing a social justice documentary or any kind of documentary takes such a commitment and so much passion. So wondering how you narrowed down on topics. And I wanted to start with you, Talia, because you have a really interesting story about how you found the family that you found.
Maybe we can do it together, and Josh can start talking about the project, big picture project, and I can take it.
Sure thing.
Sure.
Because we do want to get to this idea of programming and how that accompanies so many documentaries, the kind of how you get it out there in the community, maybe working with schools, maybe coming up with lesson plans or other sort of community engagement plans. So we will definitely get to that, the big project, big picture project.
Sure. Well, I think this came out of, I work with a company in New York called Show of Force, and we had done projects on women's empowerment, gender violence. They were titled Half the Sky and A Path Appears, based on the books by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Boudin. And those books were really part of a number of projects that really kind of sparked talking about the injustices, the myriad injustices that women face around the world, and kind of moving the dial to have a more evolved conversation about that. And we were looking around at what was happening with the refugee crisis, and also what was happening with conflict in the world, and seeing that 2015 to 2016 was the year of the highest number of conflicts in recorded history around the world, and with that, the largest displacement in the world. And so we thought that was a really compelling place to look at how could we zero in and tell human stories around refugees and migrations, and share stories that hopefully would get people to think about this in a very empathetic way, as opposed to just thinking about numbers and statistics. And we heard Idomeni, Greece was a place where thousands of refugees were amassing on the border. This was in 2016, right when borders across Europe were starting to shut down and countries were shifting in their policies towards not allowing refugees to come in. And Talia traveled to Idomeni and can take it from there.
Yeah, I want to say that I was in the office when the whole project was rolling, and I was working on something completely different. But there was a team that was working on Humanity on the Move, and I just could not stop myself from hey, I know someone who can, I heard a story that I just kept butting in. And because I think just as a citizen, watching those images over the course of the summer, before in the summer of 16, I guess, 15 or 16, 15, and this tsunami of people just walking through Europe, I just wanted to somehow be involved. I didn't know how. So this was the best opportunity. And when the suggestion came that I will go to Idomeni and see what's going on, I thought, this is great. I just drop everything else and turn up. I'm Jewish, and for me to see those images, just immediately threw me back to what generations of my family, other families have experienced 70 years ago. It was just something to connect to. And the fact that, history is repeating itself, half of the world just wants to look away, was something that I really connected to. So going to Idomeni and then finding one story out of there were about 10,000 people there when I got there. Every one of them was a great story. I mean, we stumbled on tents that had, as soon as you sort of lifted the curtain, you met a crazy story. We stood in line and waiting for lunch, and you heard incredible stuff. But this particular family, and I'll just skip some of that, we had some Facebook interaction with them before. There was a scout that had a quick interview with Gavar, and he definitely knew what we were trying to do. So when I first met with him, I knew he would be on board. And then it was a matter of, convincing the family that we're just there to tell a story. And we're trying to do that very much through their eyes, which is, I think, the most important part of this film, which is it's our film, it's Show of Force's film, but it's very much the family's film.
Yeah. And they were about to leave, I think, the next day,
They
weren't they
were-
thinking, planning? The idea
they
was
thought-
the borders were closing quickly, and they were about to leave.
The borders were already closed. They were just at the point where they're like, enough. They used to have this very, very democratic family, and they had big family meetings. So even the 9-year-old gets to opinionate about what we do next. And they just decided they're going to leave. Their neighbors, which is the next tent, felt the same way. So the younger generation of the 20 to 26-year-olds were tasked with sort of figuring out how to do it. There's a big network in the refugee camps of which road to take, what time is the patrol, how to find a cell phone with the right SIM card, and so on. And they immediately got on top of that. And they were trying to leave actually the day we got there, until it turns out that the pin for their data didn't work. So they had to delay it by a day, but the next day they were off and we were with them.
Yeah, right on time. And I know for you, Michael, it was kind of a personal thing. Wasn't it a run-in with an old friend that kind of got you rolling on this?
Yeah,
Tell us.
here, I'll utilize the microphone a little bit here. No, it was a super, it was in the news every day, the heroin problem, the opiate epidemic going on in the country, and I literally, was walking home with my dog and my son from grabbing a cup of coffee and ran into a friend of mine I hadn't seen in a long time, and I knew he had been in a bad car accident, and he looked like he was doing pretty well, and I was like, hey, you look like you're doing good, haven't seen you in a while, and he goes, the real story, and I was like, no, and I'm friends with his family and stuff like that, and he goes, yeah, I'm a heroin addict, I totaled my car on, a major highway, lucky to be alive. I've been in recovery for 11 months, living in a sober living facility, and I just looked at him going, this is a guy who, if you looked at on the outside, as far as perceptions go, good-looking guy, well-educated, was getting a master's degree at the time, good-looking, looked like he stepped off the cover of GQ, like always. So, my perception just shifted because, I looked at him and I was like, wow, this is somebody my son could grow up to be like, or, you want your daughter to date kind of thing. Like, he's that guy. And when you hear that that's who he was, and it shifts your kind of perception of, okay, who is this affecting really? And it kind of just went from there, and, one thing led to another. And so I had that interaction, went home, wrote down in a notebook an idea about, hey, I want to do a film on heroin without people shooting up or scoring dope or following a homeless person around, but tell a kind of real story of recovery, and that was kind of where it started, and then just being introduced to a whole bunch of people and following some really interesting stories.
Yeah, I want to ask you more about that because we have seen a lot of, the heroin stories that are, inside of a dingy-looking room, people shooting up, and that experience is obviously very powerful. But was that a real decision on your parts as filmmakers to not do that? Why?
Yeah, that story's been told. I mean, that was for me. I was like, I wanted to see a movie I hadn't seen before, and I didn't want to see a movie that's, that same story over and over and over again. And especially when you get to know a few people, and you're like, yeah, no, this was my version of that. And as somebody who grew up listening to music and being influenced by music and looking at things and realizing that just about every musical artist that ever influenced me growing up, somebody in that band was a heroin addict, whether it was, Miles Davis or John Coltrane, or, you can go down the list and you start naming bands like Sublime or Jane's Addiction, and you just, 9 Inch Nails, like I start going and you can't stop. And that for me was one of those things where I was like, okay, every band that I was ever interested in as a kid that influenced me creatively as a musician, yeah, there was somebody affected by heroin in that band. I was like, well, what's that kind of commonality and where did it go from? So,
Carlina.
I'll just add, and it was definitely a decision up front, but it was something we kept talking about and reminding ourselves throughout the process, because the nature of film is to titillate. So some of the time you have to check yourself, where we would come across some footage and say, wow, this is amazing stuff, but no, it's going against our precedent that we've set. So it's a challenge because titillating things are titillating for a reason.
Yeah, Joey, I want to ask you a little bit about that because the film, the organizer, follows this guy, unbelievably charismatic character. The right would call him a radical for all the reasons that they hate, and the left would call him a radical for all the reasons that they love. But you are following somebody who a filmmaker could easily fall in love with, right? So how did you work through kind of pulling back from that? Because it's a critical look at his leadership style as well.
Yeah, I would say we spend a lot of time filming with him, just on the ground, following him around, doing what he does. He goes all over the place, talking about organizing, doing training sessions, meeting with groups all over the world, and we followed him. And when we couldn't travel internationally all the time, we'd send a local crew. And so it became a very normalized relationship to have a camera rolling all these different times where he's doing his work. So we tried to keep it grounded like that because the story itself is so politicized, and when you start to look at news events that have gone on around Acorn, it's very dramatic, and it's all about, the right wing's line would be they're destroying democracy, and it's sort of this big propaganda piece. So we wanted to avoid that as much as possible. I think we include some representations of that through news media and archival stuff that we pulled out. But when filming with Wade, he's charismatic enough. We don't need to create anything. He does it himself.
But it was interesting to me learning a little bit about him and the development of Acorn, public service announcements during the 1970s, 80s with, Jack Nicholson and Morgan Freeman. So those are the kind of you put that in there, you make a decision to put that in there for a reason, because it gives us sort of credibility and it shows different things. But I'm curious about that idea about when do you feel like this is titillating?
Well, we had a lot of discussions about that. There's an old clip in a slideshow where Acorn hired Morgan Freeman before he was known as anybody to do the voiceover
before he was
something
God
that they wrote. And we found this in the archives when we were doing research. The Wisconsin Historical Society holds all these archives. And we found this, and we talked with one of the guys who was the main photographer for that slideshow, and they gave us a tape, and there's music in the background, and we had to figure out how to edit it because we weren't going to have a 5-minute Morgan Freeman interlude in the film. But then we found all these radio spots with Rob Reiner and Jack Nicholson, and people who everybody's heard of, who back then were helping support some of the work that Acorn was doing as promotion. We had a lot of discussions at different versions, trying to cut down the film to see if we were sort of falling into this trap of just using it because they're well-known names. And we kept it. They're short pieces. I think it adds a little something fun to it and shows that, Acorn's been doing this work and has had people supporting them in those, high-profile roles for a while.
Yeah. I want to ask you about that, too, because I know you are following this story. Following this family, and I don't know if people got it, but Guevara is the name of the main character. He's sort of nicknamed for Che Guevara, actually, in this family from Syria. So deeply involved in their lives, going along with them. You said something earlier about trying to, you had to find someone whose whole family would go along with this. How did that feel for you? At some points, you could have been endangering them with your crew and your camera and your lights, right?
So that was a decision that I made very early on, and as things came along, we talked about this, and we knew we're not going to break the law. So even if they are crossing a border knowingly, because sometimes you can't even tell where the border is, but if they're crossing a border illegally, we're going to meet them on the other side. We are not going to break the law. Also, I didn't want to, and this is a decision, and I think sometimes filmmakers are, some of them are activists, and I think a filmmaker activist would have made a different decision. But I made a point of not being embedded with them to the point that I would alter their journey or put them in danger. So I was not embedded with them that I did fully the same experience as they had. It brought up a whole other set of challenges, but yeah, sometimes we had to decide, and they were quite aware also of the fact that having the camera, having a light on in the middle of the night when they're trying to sneak through a highway was putting them in danger. And half of the family would sometimes go like, do not tell them where we are. So Guevara would be like, I'll just send you the location, and then it'll be like total silence. And 30 minutes later, I'll be like, what's going on? Oh, the family's not so comfortable if you show up. So we would arrange for all these meeting points where, you know, we both agreed that we're not putting them in danger. But it was a decision minute after minute. I mean, every
Negotiation
time
all
there
the
was
time, it sounds like,
negotiation.
yeah.
And I have to say, not the whole family was on board with this the whole time. They were also traveling as a bigger group. There were two families on both journeys. I don't want to do a spoiler alert, but it was another family that it had less of a stake in this film that you had to convince. And you had, what are these people from America mostly doing here with a camera? And why do we have to, and this is another part of this, let them into our lives? And I think it's probably speaking to what you've been through in some of the most vulnerable and not necessarily dignified moments. So it was really a negotiation every day, every hour that we filmed with them. And sometimes we had to sort of respect if there was a majority against us, and we just had to turn off the camera and just sit there like that.
Yeah, that is a question for Michael and Carlina. You know, these are addicts talking about their experience. Sometimes things that are just, clearly they're ashamed of them. And did anybody say, please, no, you know, I said too much?
There were people that didn't make the final cut of the film who were really happy they didn't.
Yeah.
That, you know, actually had called me and said, hey, I'm doing a lot better now. Is there any chance you can maybe kind of cut me out of that? And I was like, you know what, we had already made a decision and we pared it down to the core of the people that are in it. And so which they were very happy about. And then some people were very grateful of being able to share their story and help others. And you know, we were fortunate in that we got to show you know, Daniel's cell phone footage, you know, that he shot of himself while he was using, and some other stuff that like really gave you a different look into somebody's mindset of, you know, addiction.
Yeah, so this was, Carlina, go. No, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add that, and even despite, because, you know, there's always the legal rights versus the ethical rights. And even though, you know, in the very beginning, we got sign off from everybody beyond who we needed, at the same time, we still sat down and said, it doesn't matter. If they come to me and say, I don't want my story told now, it's done. You know, and that was something I felt very, we both felt very passionate about.
Where we were like, where it was almost this.
This could all end because we will end.
We might end up just going, you know what, this film doesn't, or this isn't going to work now because this very key portion of this film, if they say no, we're going to say, well, there goes our film.
Right. And I'm guessing that now everywhere you guys go, people talk to you about, you know, someone they know with an addiction problem or what's going on. I'm sure that's happening.
Right.
Yes.
It's been personally, it's been very interesting for me because I did lose a family member to heroin a dozen years ago when it was a very, very different climate. And when I would mention it then, the room would quiet, people would get uncomfortable. And now it's almost more humorousness, the way that people react. Oh, yeah, me too. You know, oh, yeah, I lost it. It's a disturbing kinship that we seem to share now that we didn't share 12 years ago.
Right. But I wonder about, Talia brought up this idea of the difference between the activist and the filmmaker. And I'm sure for all of you that must have come up. And I'm especially interested to talk with you about that, Josh, because you actually worked, you know, you work for an organization that is highlighting a real problem in the world right now. And this is something that could be an activist position.
Yeah, I think doing these projects always forces you to really think about your own beliefs and what you really care about. What are your priorities? Why are you telling this story? Because as Talia said, even if we're not intervening and trying to alter events, you're dedicating a lot of your life and a lot of your time to really telling this story and putting this story out there in a way that hopefully people will see it. And I think that it's always a challenge to kind of separate your personal feelings and your values from what you're making. And in a lot of ways, those values, I think, drive what the project becomes. So I think in our case, there's a commitment to the craft of documentary storytelling and journalism and telling stories that are balanced and that are fair and that really present authentic narratives. But I think there's also a desire to reach people in a way that opens up conversations, maybe changes hearts and minds and perspective. Because I think also you have to be true to your beliefs, and you have to care about the things that you care about, especially in today's world. I think we can't really say in anything we do that there's an objectivity. Everything is subjective, and I think your point of view is always subjective. And so I think it's staying true to the principles and the values that you build your work on that then would allow you to have that work to then share a larger message and then present the work and then discuss the message. So discuss what could be breakthroughs in how we think about refugees or how we think about drug addicts or how we think about inequality. I think these films offer that opportunity. I think now more than ever, powerful documentary films, powerful stories open up these doors to conversations that are unfortunately not taking place in the places that maybe they should be right now in this current political climate.
That's a really good question, because I'm guessing that the people who show up at film festivals to see a social justice documentary probably already think a lot like the documentary filmmaker who's making them. I mean, is that?
That's a good point.
I think it's a fair assumption. So I guess where do we go with that? The sort of idea of like, how do you draw an audience outside of that? And is documentary film about convincing somebody of something different?
So I wanted to add actually to what Josh said, and I think, yes, all filmmaking is subjective, and all documentaries are, to a great extent, personal. And I think that, when I started this, there were calls from the office, I don't remember, where people said, oh, you should talk to the other side. You should interview the minister of this and go to the Greek parliament and find someone from the Macedonian police. And it just didn't feel right, because as if this was a news story, it was another case, and then your position is to present the story, both sides, let the people decide. In this case, we didn't necessarily try to convince anyone, but we felt that this was a voice and a story that wasn't heard, and it just did not feel right to add those extra voices to the story. We wanted these people to be able to tell, after all these news reports, all these images, to tell their own stories without, we're just a vehicle in a way, rather than a facilitator, rather than sort of telling their story. That was how I felt about that. And we made a choice not to bring those outside voices, not to have the sort of other side as saying that this is not necessarily the case, or, and in terms of convincing, I think that the point of this documentary is just the humanity of it. And again, it's hard if people haven't seen it. It just, you see this family, and they're so much like so many other families, and possibly like yours. They're bickering, they're jokes, they just found themselves in this very unfortunate situation, which they're desperately trying to change. And that's what it's about. It's about the humanity of the situation, rather than trying to get people to be pro this or against that or politically involved. It's just to understand the humanitarian crisis that this is.
Joey, I would think that for you, the pressure was on a little bit more to show like the other side. Do you feel that way?
Well, not so much. I think that the other side is out there already on all the news channels, and it was covered from a perspective. And we were trying to tell a specific story that is, very centered around the founder, around Wade, his story, the work he continues to do, while also talking about the history of the organization that he built, along with other people.
But do you feel like there is, would you, and have you, I wonder, in reviews of the film, have you been accused of activism?
I wouldn't say accused of activism, but I think people definitely would say there's a specific perspective on it, and there's an aspect of propaganda. People would say it's a propaganda piece. I would argue that it's not, but there's the need to have multiple perspectives in the world, and there already exists one that's out there, and so sometimes it falls on in a film to provide another perspective. I set out much more to make this project because I want to use it as an organizing tool. I think it's educational, I think it's motivating, it engages people, and we want more people involved in the political process. there's also the approach that it's a personal story, and it's not about using it as for anything other than sharing an experience with people and talking about it. There's, it's a balance, I guess.
Right.
We did reach out quite a bit to people on the other side of the political spectrum. Most people didn't want to be a part of the film, and even within Acorn, there's different factions, and there's tension there between some of the original organizers from the '70s and Wade, and a lot of those people wouldn't be in our film. So we were working with what we could get people to do.
Right. Carlina, you're...
I would just add that I think it's important to clarify that being an activist filmmaker doesn't make it a bad thing. I think there are a billion approaches to filmmaking, documentary film. Big eyes, yeah, absolutely. And I think that the important thing is as long as the filmmaker is honest with themselves and with the audience about what they're trying to present, then it's fine. This is my opinion, no problem. This was my personal experience, no problem. I'm trying to convince you of something, no problem. As long as you are forthright in your intention, I think then, there's room for all of these different kinds of films.
Well, you are also, you especially, I mean, to a degree, of course, social justice and voting rights are still a problem, but you, The Heroin Effect and Earth and Sky are both very much about current policy. Current policy debates. So how did you feel about wading into that or approaching that? Or did you think, I don't want to be dated? I mean, I'm just wondering what the conversations were about that.
Oh, I'll defer to Mike on most of that, but I just want to say, as long as, if it starts a conversation, great. Like, we've had a couple screenings where people end up in fights, great. I love, or don't like what they've done, great. It's made you think about it, it's made you talk about it.
Yeah.
Success.
Yeah, I was going to say I totally agree. I wouldn't say fights, not fist fights.
Not fist
but,
fights.
No, a couple of screenings where I had somebody come up to me afterwards, an hour after, and he sat down and argued with me about my film, and I'm like, you totally don't. What he was saying to me meant so much, and I looked at him, I said, thank you, and he's like, what do you mean? He's like, I disagree with everything in your film. I know. I'm like, but we're talking about it, and I changed your perception of people who are heroin addicts or are addicted to opiates and stuff like that. And he looked at me kind of funny, and I was like, no, I appreciate everything that you just said, because you just had a moment where you felt the need to single me out in a crowded room of people, sit down with me, interrupt like dinner with my girlfriend kind of thing. Not really, it was, and sit down, and hung out, and we had this really back and forth, conversation about addiction, about heroin addiction, and he was looking at it from his perspective prior to, and really why should we help addicts? And they got themselves in this situation, and it was a great conversation, because it really helped shift his perspective and his perception of things, and I could see him being challenged with his thoughts. So it was a wonderful. It was great. I just sat there with a grin on my face, and at first I think he thought I was like mocking him, and I was like, no. Legitimately, I love the fact that you're challenging me. You and I are having a real conversation, and I think in society these days, people would rather text. They don't want to talk on a phone. You know what I mean? We sat there, two guys talking very seriously about a film. And it was wonderful, because I ran into, he happened to live in the same town as I do, or work in the same town. And I ran into him a week later getting coffee. And he looked at me, he goes, I still need to talk to you some more about your film. And I was like, you have my email, let's get together. And it was wonderful. So
that sounds to me like the thing that you would most want.
I loved it.
But is there a real conversation there? How about for you guys? I mean, because this is another thing about your film. Super hot topic in 2015, 16. Everyone saw the picture of the little kid who turned up, on the shore. I mean, just an unbelievably gripping photograph. And that was a thing. And then the news cycle moves on. And then we're all about, keeping refugees out. I mean, the news switches. So you are talking about an issue that is currently, in the U.S. at least, not as top of mind. So.
Yeah, I think, to what stands as the best testimony to that is that the U.S. has so far this year allowed 11 Syrians in.
Oh my God, really? Not that I have any opinion on that.
But yeah, I think that, again, going back to the goal of this film, this is a crisis that has been so politicized, and we're seeing the U.S. side of it in bringing people here from other countries, people who turn up here as refugees of different kind of violence. That is not war, inter-country war or what happened with the Arab Spring, and it's being used there. The image of refugee is being so politicized and being used against them. And I think what this film is trying to do is just show you that no one chooses to be in that position. And there are 26 million people now in the world, something like that, who are internationally displaced. So the fact that the news cycle has moved on doesn't mean that the crisis has ended. The fact that in the US there's less attention to that or sort of an attempt to completely shut the door, it doesn't mean that it's over. And if we're seeing what's going on in specifically Syria right now, it's just getting worse. So there'll be more people people who thought they can still hold on to whatever they had there, they'll probably try to get out of there. I don't know if they'll try necessarily to come here, but they'll try to find their way out of there. Half of Syrians are displaced right now.
Well, you all will see the film tonight, but it is one of those. I mean, I spoke to these guys earlier and told them that, it made me want to quit my job and move, to work with refugees. And there's a kind of fired upness that happens after a lot of social justice docs, if we're creating that kind of umbrella for them. So where do you go from fired up, I guess, is the question.
I think that you want to get the film out to as many, people as you can. And, we'll be broadcasting with World Channel on PBS in September, September 9th and 16th for our film specifically. But I also think we're in a moment right now where it's very easy to kind of live in our own bubbles. People talk about social media bubbles, or we talk about, Netflix and chill and staying at home and just watching whatever's on the TV and streaming. I think right now is a time that demands people going out, building communities. Just like the idea, refugees in our film, that was a political term that was made after World War II to say the world would say, never again. We're going to guarantee these rights to people because that's what we as a world community believe in. That's what we as Western democracies believe in, is that people fleeing conflict should have safe havens somewhere. They should have the opportunity to live a life that's stable, where they can follow their hopes and their dreams and have certain protections. Right now, we're in a place where that's all up in the air. And it's a profoundly difficult question, but it's also a profoundly important question in terms of who we are as people. Who are we as a Western democracy? Who are we as the greatest country in the world? These questions are more relevant than ever now, and they require people coming together to talk about that. So I think for us, we've done this in the past on our other project. This is part of an umbrella project called Humanity on the Move, where we'll be going to communities, we'll be going to college campuses, we'll be starting screening groups. Right now, the same way a film like The Organizer or The Heroin Effect is about people coming together to talk about this. It's about reaching out, it's about building communities, it's about staying in touch with each other right now, because that's where these battle lines are being drawn, between people coming together, people standing up for what they're believing in. It's not going to happen just by posting on Facebook or staying home and binge watching television. It's going to happen getting people together, building community, standing together, and speaking for what you believe in. And so I hope the film is a catalyst for that. And that's really what I think these films are all about, an opportunity for people to come together like this, to talk about these issues, make connections, make bonds, and then do something together.
Well, it's difficult enough to get a film made. It sounds like to me, programming and everything that goes around the screenings, where they're placed, that kind of strategy, is that an essential part of making a documentary film now? I'm looking at you, Joey.
Yeah, I mean, you're from day one, I think you're thinking about where it's going to go and who's going to see it and how are you going to reach them. And, we started this film 8 years ago, and the landscape of how people are consuming content has changed quite a bit in the last 8 years. So we've tried to adapt our, approach to it. And we're still figuring out where it's going to be, how it's going to get out there, what distributors we're going to work with. But we're doing a lot of what you were just talking about, which is engagement on the local level. We're working on building a nationwide screening campaign, collaborating with national groups that already exist, such as, we're talking with them, it's not established yet, Indivisible, Move On, Citizen Action, those type of groups that already do local work and local organizing everywhere. And we want to use this film as an organizing tool, where you host a screening in a community, you invite the people out there who are maybe part of them are already members of the local group, and people who you want to sign up, so that you motivate people, you educate people, and then at the end you engage them and you get people to sign up and become a part of what whatever group is doing work that's important to them in their community. That can also, our idea and goal is to not only engage people with local groups across the country, but to increase voter turnout in the fall, and that this whole campaign will lead to a wider release in September and October on a platform such as Netflix or whatever, ahead of the midterms, so that people then turn out. That's the idea. Forget exactly what you asked,
Well,
but it's...
is this an essential part of making a documentary film now, that you create a kind of programming arm around it and obviously a strategy for getting it out in communities?
I mean, I would say, just to close that idea, it's like if you don't premiere your film at Sundance or Berlin or South by Southwest or Toronto or Tribeca, yeah, you most likely have to do your own, or do some capacity, distribute your film yourself.
How much of your job on this film was that?
Well, we haven't distributed it yet.
Okay. Okay.
If you know anybody.
Carlina.
I just wanted to emphasize your point about community and connection with groups, because one of my biggest things that I learned in making documentaries before this is the importance of those connections. There are a lot of great organizations out there already. The world doesn't need another New Hampshire opioid organization, and I think it was really important for me to learn the lesson of connecting with people who have a need that I can fill, rather than trying to take on these tasks myself. I'm the filmmaker. I'm not the expert. To know my place, I am providing this media content, and to work with great people who want your content and you are fulfilling each other's needs. I think those are the best relationships that I've had the pleasure of being in.
Want to make sure we get some time for audience questions. Anybody? Hi.
Well, have you ever, any of you, felt that when you're being approached by or soliciting a festival, that you'd like to put the Q&A contribution to focus on networking locally rather than on the film? Because now you have fired up the community, but you're not harnessing that energy. And it seems to me you can facilitate and encourage on the ground work, which has got to be somewhere in your mission, or at least seeing that kind of outcome has got to be something you care about. So it seems to me the festival idea needs to pivot.
There's a couple things that I think about that, which is festivals often are scheduled back to back to back, and there's 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A. And like you were just saying, it's not necessarily us or the festival who has that reach in the community where the film is playing. So unless we're able to partner with a local group who's going to engage people and translate that motivation that people have at the end of the screening into continued action and organization and a campaign that they're running, that without that, it's very hard to do. So we've talked about doing this a lot with different festivals. We have some different degrees of being able to do that successfully, but we're not really there yet. We haven't been able to find that model that is replicable, that will work, whether it's a festival or a university or a community group hosting a screening.
I'm curious if the panel would find, now versus maybe 10 to 12 years ago, I feel like there's more of a hunger for the kind of content we create now for the cause. I think that the power of story is being recognized more and more, maybe over the past decade, and whereas before it was seen as a fluff piece of a project, it is now seen as an integral part to do.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that, I totally take your point. I wish there would be more times in our screenings where we could really interact with the community. And I think some festivals, every festival is different. Some have more of an opportunity for that. Others are more totally industry facing.
But when you contract, can you say that this would be your concern, that you would like to see, without people brushing off to the rest of the festival, or without people being just individuals when they've shared this space?
I think that depending on where your film is in a festival, you can kind of make more demands. I think a lot of times as filmmakers, you're really getting into the festival and then figuring things out from there. But even in those moments, we've connected with legal groups in Durham. We were at the Full Frame Festival, and we met through Duke, a number of community groups that are hosting refugees. We're going to be doing screenings with them. We're going to be doing advocacy work with them. So even in those 15-minute moments, there's opportunities to like make connections and then get people moving on the ground. We were doing it in California. We've been doing it in Oregon. So for us, we take that seriously, and I think after every Q&A as filmmakers, we're not just looking to talk to the person from Amazon or whatever.
Right.
We're there to meet with people who are doing good work in the communities. That's, I think, important to Talia and myself, and I think everybody on this panel. Like, you can't separate that from
Right.
the work.
And this comes through in the community screenings, I think, that we're all doing, especially. We had a great screening this morning with a lovely conversation after, and something I think, and I've seen this in other screenings, and something Michael and I feel is important, we love to have an expert in opioid addiction with us on the Q&A because we tend to get so many questions. We all become a little bit mini experts in the thing you make a film on, but you're still the filmmaker, you're not the expert. And I personally really value, and I know because of this too, when we have like someone like Natalie this morning, who is an expert in her field to handle those questions.
I want to pick up on your point, though, Carlene. You were talking about the greater thirst for these kind of stories in the last 10 years. But in this intervening 10 years, people are watching a lot more content from their phones or at home. I mean, getting people out into a participatory civic space, if I can use that term, is that more difficult? And, who goes to film festivals? It's kind of the usual suspects. Yeah, exactly.
Except for film festivals often these days get used as a catalyst to bring content to wider media. So there will be, and Netflix and Amazon and Apple, they're watching what's being watched in film festivals. So, I come from a background where a lot of my documentaries aired on TV. And, there would be 200 people in the room or 500 people in the room for a film festival, but another film that I made just ran 2 weeks ago, and it was 500,000 people watched it that night. I think that there's still power in those festivals and in the ability to reach influencers, if you like, people who can bring it further. I think that there's a lot of criticism now of the Netflixing of a lot of this industry, but Netflix and Amazon have taken on very, projects that are full of subtitles, which was unheard of, 5 years ago. Issues like heroin that were difficult to watch for people, shorts that were harder to find homes for. You can find them now on those platforms. So you may have to search and have them edited to your algorithm somehow, but the festivals are helping in some way to get to those wider platforms.
Any other questions here from the audience?
I'm curious what you're all working on as your next project. Could we hear from all of you?
I can't quite tell. It has to do, actually, I'll just say it has to do with a different kind of refugee crisis that is affecting the U.S. right now.
I'm working on a few different projects, but one project in particular is talking about inequality in America and the real story of how many millions of people are falling through the cracks in America. So we're just getting started on that, and it's very exciting because it's kind of taking an honest look at a lot of the untold stories of injustice and inequality here in this country.
Joshua, tell us again the website for, is it Humanity on the Move?
Yeah, so humanityonthemove.org is where you can find this film. We also did a couple of films on Central American migration and what's happening in El Salvador and Guatemala and Mexico for, kind of the U.S. border policies. But, Sky and Ground is, one that we're going to be taking out to a number of places. We'll be screening at a few other festivals. We'll also be broadcasting with PBS in September. So I encourage you guys to check out the website and find out more information. We'll also be updating it with resources where you can find ways to get involved in groups supporting migration and refugees and having conversations about this issue that aren't really happening right now, I think, in some of the mainstream media outlets.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Joey? Besides getting a distribution deal?
Starting a new documentary about a very well-known tattoo artist named Mark Mahoney, who was one of the founders of the Black and Gray tattoo movement. So it will chart some of the changes from the 70s until now and the discuss themes such as commercialization and mainstreamization of tattoos.
Wow.
That
How about-
sounds fun.
Yeah.
A little different than this one.
I like it. Let's see, so I have three things. I am producing Lena Barakat's film, Light Attaching to a Girl, so she's in post on that, and that's very fun. I'm working on another documentary with Bob Nesson of Nesson Media out of Boston about a couple of gentlemen who were sentenced to life without parole at age 18, and just the ridiculousness of sentencing someone for life when they're a child. And then hopefully I'll be going with an NGO based out of Boston to an area in southern Africa to film testimonials from girls who have been involved in a supportive nurturing program, and just testimonials of how they've experienced that and their successes and failures, et cetera, for stakeholders.
Wow. How about you, Michael?
I love the fact that everybody's got a great story here. Other than working on distribution, I do.
And tell them what you're doing with.
Well, I'm going to take a break
Yeah.
from making films for a little while, just because after, you throw 3 years and you go, I need a break for a little while. Like I always joke, I'm like, I need to do like a horror film, just because it's so outside anything, which I'm afraid of horror films. And I just want to yell cut and then laugh because everything is so obscenely stupid in horror films, yet scary when you watch them.
Tell them about the Granite State Recovery thing, though. 'Cause
Oh
that's
yeah.
an interesting progression.
Well, through the film, I met somebody who's in the film, Eric Spofford, who owns Granite Recovery Centers as well as Spofford and Companies, which is. But through doing some freelance stuff with him, one day he was like, "Hey, I want to do a whole social media thing and start this whole division and really attack that." And he's like, "You interested?" And I was like, "Yeah." And so we sat and talked, and so now I'm the social media content creator, the director of social media content creation
example of the hunger for
and we started doing videos, and all of a sudden they're getting 40,000 views, and escalating to the point where there's this, he was at a Big Brothers Big Sisters event, and people were coming up to him going, "Oh my God, I love the videos you're putting out every day. I can't wait for them. We keep looking for them." He was like, "Great," and so we're growing that portion of it. and
Where are
doing-
they? Where can someone find this?
Where-
Where can somebody find their? your-
on Facebook.
In various
The
different
Facebook,
places.
Twitter,
All over the
Instagram. It's on all those platforms, but it's Granite Recovery Centers.
Granite
And
Recovery
the other thing is it's also his own personal brand that's
Mm-hmm.
expanding out of that, which is Eric Spofford. But yeah, so it's been kind of funny going, it's like I'm dealing in some ways doing the same thing I've been doing for the last 3 years on this film. It's like, hey, I'm going to go, meet up with all these people who are in recovery
Mm-hmm.
now and talking to them about their passion for recovery and helping others and doing all that. And it's interesting because in a weird way, it's a corporate workspace.
Yeah.
But it's unlike any corporate workspace I was ever in. Everybody's happy. Like everybody that I work with, it's hysterical, like how much fun people have and like working together, and it's a great community vibe. And the one other thing I want to say is every single person mentioned the word community as they were doing this. Early on, when we didn't have our working title for the film was Community is Greater Than Heroin. And it's kind of that sentiment that community seems to be something that's lost in America these days, and kind of needing to bring that back, whether it's in a film community, whether it's in kind of anything, but just that idea of people together, not apart, you know what I mean? Like not binge watching things at home and stuff like that, but actually like going to a theater and seeing a film or something.
Yeah.
I think there's something about that aspect of community that I think has been lost, and hopefully we get back,
Well, and I'm glad we've got some of that here. Any other additional questions? Just last call, burning desires. Quickly, who do you most want to see your film? Like you can even name one person if you want.
It's such a cliche. He'll never have the attention span. But someone who's been giving such bad name to people from other countries, especially from the Muslim world, like our president. He would never have the attention span to sit through 86 minutes. Maybe the trailer.
Yeah, I would say, Donald Trump and Mike Pence. Maybe the Pope could watch it. I think he'd enjoy it.
I don't know, Obama.
I'm going to be almost a little serious and say I lost a sister to heroin, so I hope someone who has a sister sees the film and doesn't lose someone. That's my dream, that someone comes up and says, I'm still here. I didn't lose my sister because of you. This film. Yeah.
Well, now I can't see.
I know.
Yeah,
You guys have
that.
said,
I get all emotional.
Trump, who I would love to see our film. Barack Obama, who I think would actually watch our film. You know what I mean? I agree with that, especially, and spoiler alert, but when you do a film and people that are in it, you lose them, and they pass away, and you actually go back and shoot stuff based on the fact that somebody passed away who's in your film, and you kind of deal with that in a weird way. You go, wow, now I have to edit my film differently, or I have to go reach out and shoot some more footage and add it to a film because the story's not complete. I mean, I'd love it if, I don't know, if it affected change and whoever you could get to watch it. But yeah, Trump doesn't have the attention span for it, but I would love it.
There's no reading involved.
There's no
Please go and see
pictures.
Sky and Ground tonight. The Jonathan Daniel Award winner. The screening starts at 7:15, so be there early on to show your stuff on the red carpet and make sure you get a seat. I want to thank Talia Tibbin and Joshua Bennett from Sky and Ground. Also, Joey Carey, he's the producer of The Organizer, and Carlina Lyons and Michael Venn, who are the respective writer and producer, director of The Heroin Effect. Please join me in thanking them.
Thanks for having us.
And go see your next movie.